Hey, this is Mike Klassen, and welcome to Vancouver Overcast, a podcast where we have conversations with city leaders and innovators. My guest today is Stewart Muir, Executive Director of Resource Works, where he champions for a strong and sustainable natural resources sector in Canada. Stewart is a historian, author, and award-winning journalist with a passion for the natural legacies of British Columbia. His work has included a history of the Strait of Georgia, also known as the Sailor Sea, and examinations of racism and censorship in BC's past. He's also worked in the newspaper business, contributing editorial content and marketing strategies for the Canadian Press, Global Mail, and the Vancouver Sun. And now it's time for Vancouver Overcast. So I've got Stewart Muir here with us on the line. And Stewart, can you tell me where you are right now? Because I think this is actually kind of exciting for me as a new podcaster. Where are you right now?
This week I'm in London, England, where I will be taking part in a conference at Canada House at the Canadian High Commission in Trafalgar Square.
How does an event like that happen, and how do you get invited to an event like that?
I get invited because I've been following an area of industrial development, natural gas, LNG to be specific, liquefied natural gas, which is the kind that you can put on a ship and move to wherever you want to put it in the world, unlike natural gas normally that is trapped in pipes and moves from one place on land to another place on land. LNG, everyone's been hearing about it, that in BC. It probably needs little description. I'm here because I've been following this field for a long time. Actually, it goes back about 20 years since when I was business and finance editor at the Vancouver Sun, for the first time in the history of the newspaper, brought on an energy reporter because we saw what was happening in the northeast of British Columbia with the development at that time of natural gas. And it very quickly, in those days, developed into a significant part of the BC economy. So it goes back a long way for me. And I've become, I think, a little bit of an expert in Canada on how this is an area of high potential for Canadian exports. Mainly, we've been talking about Asia, and that's what BC is all about with the LNG Canada in Kitimat, another significant one proposed in that same area of northwest BC, and then the wood fiber LNG closer to Vancouver. So now, however, we're seeing the East Coast develop because Europe is looking to reduce its carbon footprint. It wants to get away from coal. It has to go to something that's reliable and affordable. Natural gas is that solution. And so we're looking in this conference we're having to share the Canadian story about how it's going to be a part of that export mix, and we think a desirable one for a number of reasons.
There's a very robust environmental movement. I think probably some of the leaders of the environmental movement are from the UK. Have you had a chance to get a sense of what the feeling is among Britons when it comes to natural gas? I know that they've had some very aggressive legislation around fracking, for example. How does Canada fit into all that mix?
Well, in Britain, they love to use natural gas. They aren't so keen on developing the onshore natural gas potential that they seem to have. And so over time, it could be that they recognize this is something they want to tackle. You know, it's a new idea, fracking on land in Britain. So it may just take time and maybe growing confidence and awareness of the technology, because there's a huge amount of progress that's happening in that regard. This is a country where we have seen the Extinction Rebellion take hold. We've seen whole parts of the city of London shut down in recent months because of popular movements and young people, not only young people, but especially young people, are demanding improvement and change in the impact that carbon emissions have on the planet, as well they should. And I think the recognition that we have, for a while it was, okay, we're going to transition very, very quickly to this renewables nirvana. There will be no more carbon emissions because we'll have this exciting new technology that will provide these solutions. I think as our understanding of how this happens in practice rolls out, there is probably a growing recognition that we do need to have not just the perfect solution as the alternative, but also progress with ones that perhaps aren't perfect in every way, but at least they're better than the things we rely on now. So natural gas is clearly better than coal if you are talking about it in terms of what comes out when you combust it to make electricity. And that's really the big issue. And it's not just a UK issue. For Canada right now, getting LNG to the European market, we're talking about Poland. They're very interested. Germany, I know there's a great deal of ambition in Germany to transition to this renewable state. It's proved to be very, very difficult in practice, and they're actually increasing the amount of coal rather than reducing it, even as they add lots of wind and solar and cool stuff like that, which I'm 100% in favor of. But the reality is proven to be a little more complicated. So, Canada being in that mix. And, one thing, in Europe, a lot of the gas they use today is from Russia. And for obvious reasons, geopolitically speaking, being able to diversify the supply so they aren't beholden for their heating on just one country that happens to be, pretty, unusual regime is a shrewd thing to do for politicians. And if Canada can come into that, then that's a good thing for everybody.
That is the dynamic at play here, that you really do need to have the people who represent the energy sector at the table when you are talking about sustainability. And I suppose that's a little bit of the irony. You have to, demand change, but you have to have the people who can actually make that change happen, be a strong part of that dialogue, which kind of brings me to Resource Works and its mandate. Remind me when Resource Works was started.
Yeah, Mike, you've been part of this. We've had over the years a running conversation on what are the issues in this space. I've really enjoyed your input. You've had some really good suggestions, but it goes back to 2014. That's when we launched this new nonprofit. We took the approach that, look, there's a shortage of information that's relevant to some of the questions. There's also other research and information out there that maybe doesn't get heard enough, so we could perhaps shine a light on it that's a little brighter. And also we could expand the conversation, figure out what's lacking. Why do we have this sort of polarized thing going on? It still certainly persists. What is a way to come at it from the values of people who share space, don't have to agree with everybody on everything, but find that common ground about what we do agree on. We did some research early on, public opinion research and social science research, and we found that, despite the sense there's all these big disagreements, most people agree on the important stuff. We want to have a clean environment to live in. We want to be able to afford to live the way that we think is desirable for ourselves, our elders, our children. We want to be able to pass these things on to the next generation. And how do we do that? So it's not like there is this sort of polarized, half society is over here and half is over there, and there's a war going on. It's not like that at all in reality. I think there's a broad consensus. So can we start back at what we have in common and build from there is, I think, maybe the most effective thing that can be done today. And that's true. 6 years later, I think all of those things are true.
My guest is Stewart Muir. He's the Executive Director of Resource Works. Stewart, if we are going to have this, I suppose, civil conversation about how resources are going to help us transition into a low-carbon economy, how do you square that with some of the rhetoric and perhaps some of the emotion that comes from, for example, the Extinction Rebellion movement, the voice of Greta Thunberg? Is there a possibility that Canadians can have that kind of conversation? And I suppose, by extension, are leaders in government able to have that conversation with the public as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I see in this is that there's a divergence between what we have in front of us that we can do in our daily lives and then what happens on the global level. Right now, anyone can make a choice to change how they get around. They can change the kind of car they have. They can bicycle or walk. They can choose foods that they think are more sustainable. They can do all that sort of stuff that's in your personal domain. But then there's this thing going on where China continues to grow its emissions, for example, as does India, two examples of these very large countries and economies. and many, many other countries out there. Whereas Canada, very small population, relatively small emissions, although we, on a per capita basis, we have the emissions of wealthy people because we are wealthy people. We are high emitters. The fact we're only 37 odd million people means that it doesn't add up to a lot, but we do feel, I think most people would agree, let's set an example for the world, even if that example, when done perfectly, is going to do nothing to change the world. When you look at India and China together, they add the emissions equivalent of 10 Canadian oil sands every year. It is a gigantic amount of growth. That's just the increase, not the large base that we have. And so as this continues over time, how can Canada add what it's good at to this? Because simply disappearing, turning the lights out on Canada is not going to change the world. However, if the drive towards improved technology, higher standards and regulations, which are very much characteristic of the Canadian way of doing things, can be part of what we share to the world, I think that's equally important as it is being able to share made in Canada commodities like natural gas that we've been talking about that happen to be as well lower emissions because of the way they're made. You know, if you are, as we're doing in BC right now, because of the Clean BC plan the provincial government has brought forward, they're reducing the amount of gas that's burned to extract and process gas in Northeast BC, and they're replacing it with hydroelectricity that is zero carbon. Other parts of the world that produce natural gas are not doing that because they either don't have the ability or they don't have the inclination, or both. And that's how we can legitimately say, as we are doing here in London this week, that we've got this low carbon product. So the more of that we can bring to the world, the better. I mean, you look at the size of, again, the natural gas example. We are the fourth largest reserves of natural gas in the world. We have well-developed infrastructure. It's underutilized on the East Coast and also in some ways on the West Coast. So we're ready to go. We just need to get things to market, and it will allow people to implement their own plans for meeting the Paris Agreement. You know, we tend to think about our own commitments, and that's all you ever really hear about. But don't forget, there's 200 countries that signed this agreement. Every one of them has got a problem to solve if it's going to get towards those targets. And they don't have the solutions to that within their borders in most cases. So we've got to be part of that global system if we're going to make a difference.
Stuart, you're a parent. I have a young daughter in her teens. We are, I guess, of the X, boom, whatever generation, but it seems to me that we've been able as Canadians to be divided along different lines, geographic, economic, and now generational lines. You know, you've been out talking to people for all of these last 6-7 years. What do you think are the tools that we need to be able to have a dialogue amongst each other so young people aren't kind of doing the okay boomer thing and boomers aren't sending around emails laughing at how kids have cell phones and those things take a lot of energy to create? Have you figured out that kind of civil place where we can all be together in some of your travels?
Well, I think it's a lot closer to be able to achieve that than sometimes it feels. Right now, for example, the Alberta or Alberta-Saskatchewan relationship feels really broken, but I don't think it's that far off. There's so many people in BC. You know, if you scratch a BCer, often as not, there's an Albertan underneath. I was born in southern Alberta myself, but raised from the age of 7 in BC. And that's just so typical. Nothing unusual about that at all. There's always been a back and forth. And, you know, my sense of Alberta right now is not that Alberta wants to leave Canada. Yeah, there's a few yahoos who are saying that. But I think there is a deep feeling that Alberta has not been listened to or respected in the last few years. And the tendency I see in the national media, if that's a measure of anything, is to just simply dismiss that as Alberta whinging. You know, I see that all the time, and it's just not fair. There's some things that are external to any Canadian decision making, things like the world price of oil. And for sure, no one could change that. And it's not the only factor that's affected Alberta. There's been policies, federal policies in particular, and then not just carbon pricing, and I support carbon pricing. I was on the scene in BC in 2006, 7, 8, when that policy and law ultimately was generated. We were part of helping it to be a successful law by insisting on it as a carbon neutral, or I should say a revenue neutral law. So all the revenues from this would flow back to ultimately the people who paid it. And that made it politically palatable. So it took some trade-offs to make it happen, but it's been a robust result. And if that can be replicated federally, this sort of mutual respect, and we're gonna use these revenues not just as a tax grab for government, but we're going to use them to encourage taxpayers to change their behavior in a carrot rather than a stick way, then we're onto something really good. But Albertans seem to feel that it's just been stick. They've had laws that are specifically targeted, like Bill C-48, which is the tanker ban, that really affects only Alberta. It's not in the law that it is meant to do that, but in practice, that is how it works. And that means that Canadians are giving up hundreds of billions of dollars of future economic benefit for no improvement in the safety of how goods are transported. And the officials in the Federal Transport Ministry actually advised the politicians that the Northwest route was actually safe. Safer than other routes that are used in Canada that no one seems bothered by. So from the Alberta perspective, that's how they see it. And I think if we have Chrystia Freeland tasked with this, if we have a new Minister of Natural Resources who is already visiting Calgary to reach out to the industry, if we've got Jim Carr, the former NRCan Minister, Natural Resources Canada, who has made some creative and I think brave suggestions on how to fix this, it means that we're seeing a little bit of give. And, that's, I hope, the Canadian way. So finally, there are, some bright spots here. We'll see how it develops going forward. But I think it's necessary because one thing that the Trudeau Liberals were not doing too much of in their first term was looking at the finances of the country. They were more concerned about some of the other aspects of governing. And you start to look around the planet right now, you look at the unrest in whether it's in Chile or a whole bunch of other countries. This is accompanied by a trade war between the U.S. and China that is threatening to escalate. Who knows where it could go? Canada has suffered as well in its exports. And right now we're in a very delicate moment. This is the kind of time when you want to be together and moving in the same direction as a country. And it will be millennials who feel this the most, the ones who are striving to get their savings to the point where they can buy that house and start that family. Right now they're squeezed. So I think we urgently do need to have a better way of having this national discussion.
So my guest is Stewart Muir. Is the Executive Director from Resource Works. We're going to take a quick break and we will pick this conversation up and shift gears slightly. Stewart, you were talking about some of the new government, emissaries that are going to start making their way across the country and talking to the energy sector and I suppose other parts of the natural resource economy in Canada. What was your sort of key takeaway from the cabinet announcement that happened in the past week?
Well, they seem to recognize that Quebec is going to need some special attention. They've elevated the profile, I think, in cabinet of some key Quebec MPs. So that's a good thing if your goal is to show Quebec that you're really paying attention. But they also need to do the same for Alberta because it's Alberta in the economic equation that pays the rent. And I'm borrowing a phrase there from a dear friend who's an economist, decades in the field, who uses that phrase to describe the degree to which we rely on Alberta. So if we see these key ministers, Minister Freeland, Minister O'Regan, in particular, taking the time to develop the relationships. We've got Anne McClellan, a former federal minister who's now retired from politics but re-engaged, also doing some work. It hopefully will show that there's some intent behind it. And notice recently we've seen Doug Ford, surprisingly to a lot of people, who is actually saying nice things about Justin Trudeau. Can you believe that? I think that there's been a thaw between Premier Kenney of Alberta and Premier Horgan of British Columbia. It started probably back in the summer of 2019 when they had a chance to meet in Saskatchewan and spend a bit of time together. So I think that relationship has slowly improved. The fact of the matter is that the BC government has gone through the tools in its toolbox that it was talking about during the 2017 election. Remember, we'll use every tool in the toolbox to stop that pipeline. Well, they've gone through the tools in the toolbox, and they're not going outside the toolbox. They're working within the laws. And that was an emphasis made by the Premier. I heard him a few days ago. He gave a speech to the Vancouver Board of Trade at their annual business summit. He was quite specific and emphatic. It was clear to me that Premier Horgan wanted to make it crystal clear that BC is not standing in Alberta's way today to get the Trans Mountain Pipeline built, because it's done everything that it said it would do. So Premier Kenney, I think, is in a much better frame of mind about BC. There's still a sense, though, that just the average Albertan, that BC is a sort of wild card. And I think it would be worth improving on that, because we are so interconnected in so many ways, not just our personal backgrounds that a lot of people have, but the two economies are synced up so tight. So I feel we're in a better place in the end stage of 2019 than we were a year ago or 2 years ago, by far.
It really is interesting, and as somebody who watches the local government activities here in Metro Vancouver, the change of mayor in the city of Burnaby to Mike Hurley, away from Derek Horgan, seems to have really turned down the temperature on the whole discussion around the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Not to say that those activists have any intention of letting up, but we're just not seeing it. And of course, Burnaby is where a lot of, will probably be impacted the most, because it has refineries there, and it's right on the route where the pipeline the terminus exists. And even in the city of Vancouver, Mayor Kennedy Stewart, who got himself arrested on a pipeline protest, has I read this week that he's in Ottawa taking meetings with federal government staff and probably people in the PMO. He has not talked a lot about this issue lately, and he seems to be striking a very pragmatic tone when it comes to the federal partnership. So I guess there are probably some changes that are going to have an effect over on this side of the Rockies as well. I want to just talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of innovations that are taking place, because it seems to me that that's almost the missing piece that we don't talk about. Obviously these are intensive. For example, working in the oil sands it's dirty work that requires a lot of energy to get that energy. But I know that in that sector and in forestry and in other places, there have been innovations that are either reducing carbon or making it much cleaner, and in terms of its ability to get those products to market. What are a couple of the ones that you've seen that are stories that people might not know about?
In just a general sense, before diving back into that specifically, and I think it's an excellent point you raise, Mike, is in the last 6 years that I've been doing Resource Works, coming at it as a generalist. My master's is in history. I've spent most of my career in storytelling and journalism, and I'm not an engineer. I'm not a geologist or a chemist. I'm not an accountant either, for that matter. Although I'm interested in all these areas, I like to stay on top of things. But I'll tell you, the thing that struck me most is the people, and I've met hundreds of people across the country, especially in BC. I've met people internationally. I've got a sense of the context of our goods producing industries in Canada, and who are the people responsible for that. And I'm just so impressed by the professionalism, the environmental awareness, And I often hear this from industry people, and you might think, okay, this will be something self-promoting from the industry, but it's actually true, in my opinion, that the most dedicated and expert environmentalists you will meet anywhere are the people working for resource companies at the front lines of applying technology, ensuring that the regulations, and by the way, our Canadian regulations are incredibly strict. Most of the world could do with Canadian regulations if their goal is to protect the environment. And you have to meet those by increasing all the time. I mean, just look at the carbon regime in BC. It requires every year the GHG, the greenhouse gas intensity of the gasoline that is sold, to be reduced every year. They have to find some way to get better. And so they're doing all kinds of different things. It's not just one solution. And so these people, could be, the mine tailings thing. There was a conference last week. It was supposed to be 400 people, but because there's been some problems in Brazil, there were over 700 of the world's experts in mining tailings who converged on Vancouver to figure out what to do. They are so hyper concerned with this area. And so, that's the people that we can trust, who I think are trustworthy. We have excellent university college programs, or trade unions that are on the tools doing this work. So impressed. They have their own training colleges and programs, and they're always looking to get better across the board. That's my experience. So starting with the people, that's a pretty good story. When it comes to these broader changes, given the fact we have one planet and we are headed towards, in a couple of decades, 10 million people on that one planet, can we keep this good life going that we've got? I was out for a walk in London today. I'm staying close to where there's a lot of the shopping districts, and everything's all lit up for Christmas. I went down Bond Street and Regent Street. Oh my God, the languages from around the world. People are out there, they're consuming like never before in the history of the world. They are economically interdependent. If we see Brexit in Britain, heaven knows how they're going to handle it here, because every place I go to, restaurant, shop, is staffed by people who do not have English or Scottish or Welsh accents. They've come here, and in this world of consumption, how do we keep that going? If and are we consuming too much? I mean, I think in a lot of ways we are. I think just in the course of my life, when I was young, we just did not have the consumer culture that we have now. So these are tough questions, and there's not really one single voice of authority on it. And that's why I think environmentalists are so frustrated right now. It's in a sense, it's a great time to be a Greta Thunberg, because these issues are so prominent, but it's also an incredibly frustrating time because the monumental scale of humanity's impact on the earth is mind-boggling.
My guest is Stewart Muir. He's the executive director from Resource Works, which is based here in British Columbia, but he's speaking to me from London, England today. Hence, perhaps a little bit of the technical sort of sounds that you're hearing. He's not sitting across the table from me, but we hope we'll be able to do that again soon. Stewart, I saw you got pretty fired up during the election campaign on the issue of salmon farming. That is an industry that has, I suppose, quietly been trying to help the public to have a better understanding of what it is. And of course, there are groups out there that are determined to tell another story about salmon farming. What do you think the public should know about that industry and what it means to a lot of the coastal communities here in BC?
I think it's an industry that, like a lot of things, it started in an early stage of not being perfect in everything it did. 25 years ago, when salmon farming came to British Columbia, the practices hadn't evolved. Over that time, they have been, for a whole bunch of reasons, partly because it's an industry that's grown globally in the capital centers, particularly Norway. The investments in technology and practices have improved so much over the years. Unfortunately, the reputation that salmon farming got in its earlier years has stuck to the industry, and I think that's been used by some opponents who have a variety of different reasons why they might not want to see salmon farming, to be pretty strong adversaries against it. And I'm always interested in the evidence and the facts, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't out there just promoting or talking about an industry in a favorable sense, because I felt like it. It's always important to understand the facts. I've spoken to numerous salmon scientists, some of the most eminent ones in British Columbia. I've looked them in the eye and I've said, does salmon farming harm wild salmon? And consistently, the answer I get back is that no, we do not have evidence of the effects that are alleged by some. And now I know there's some scientists, or in some case, I guess aspirational scientists, people who would wish to be considered scientists who perhaps aren't, but also some scientists who have questioned evidence and do their own research, which is as it should be. But I think if you look at the preponderance of scientific expertise, it is that we can do this. So it's barely relevant that salmon farming is the largest agricultural export in British Columbia. I mean, if it wasn't sustainable, if we couldn't do it properly, that would be totally irrelevant. I mean, the fact is, it is this large export, and it is being done, in my opinion, based on the research I've conducted, responsibly and safely. So that's why I was pretty cheesed off when the federal Liberals in BC during the recent election campaign made this promise by 2025, a timeline no one's ever talked about. They would move the industry onto land into closed containment, which is a pretty radical move that most experts, every expert that I know of, viewed as basically the death knell of salmon farming in BC. So that's thousands of jobs. And I've also had the chance to meet a lot of the people working in it. They are so conscientious, and they all say in different ways the same thing that I've been saying. They'll often say, I would never have gotten into this field if I thought for a minute that what I was doing would harm wild salmon, because these are conservationists, environmentalists, they're nature lovers. They would be horrified if they thought that, and they're in a privileged position, informationally speaking, and they're working in the field and in the wild. They know what's going on. So I think a very political promise that was made rashly at a time when the campaign maybe wasn't going the way the Liberals thought it should, and a strategic vote-seeking decision was made. Whether cooler heads prevail in this, we have a new fisheries minister from the East Coast, where salmon farming is almost universally respected and appreciated, which is a little different than BC, where it's more contentious. I think that might help there to be a return to an evidence-based decision process, and some of the politicization we've seen can be backed off. And I guess the final thing I'd say, Mike, is that Indigenous people, there's at least 15 First Nations I personally know of that have economic arrangements with the salmon farming industry that create jobs and benefits in local First Nations communities. And without exception, these are Indigenous communities that do not have other economic options. They aren't located in downtown Vancouver. They don't have full-time, well-paying jobs available. They have seasonal employment, often not that well-paying. They are isolated geographically, so people can't just go off to the city to work from a remote place in the Broughton Archipelago. They're kind of stuck there. So they've seen and appreciated this, and I hear numerous First Nations, of course not 100%. There's no 100% of anything out there when it comes to public opinion, but a very significant number of First Nations rely on this industry and think it's safe.
I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that British Columbia's economy has an absolutely huge agri-food sector, and aquaculture, shellfish farming, and then you go onto land where you've got cherries and cranberries and other kinds of, and of course our wine industry, which is growing by leaps and bounds, but add up to billions of dollars of economic activity in BC, whereas we've always sort of seen ourselves as the hewers of wood and drawers of water. It's really a much more diverse economy here, and I suppose that's one of the great blessings of living in BC, is that we can do all those things plus advance a new, economy around technology. I was going to also just point out just a personal anecdote when you talked about the people who work in the resource sector and how proud they are of their work. In a past life, I worked as a location manager for a film company, and I remember going in to shoot some location photos in the Squamish River Valley, and I encountered somebody who was in the forestry business and pulled over, and he said, if you step on one of my little plantings there, I'll wring your neck. So these guys really want, they see the whole continuum of forestry, and they care about every bit of it. So I'm going to just slightly shift gears here, and we'll come back and we're going to talk about Canada's media sector. Stewart, you worked in the newspaper business for part of your career, and I know that you had done a lot of work in terms of rebranding and redesigning some newspaper products in the past. You can talk about that if you want, but this week's news about the closure of all of these small local Toronto Star media affiliates was, I think, really quite shocking in a sector that doesn't seem to lack for sorry news about closures and layoffs. This one was so kind of came out of the blue, having seen them move. As if you live in Metro Vancouver, you saw that the Star Metro paper was a terrific product, if you'd like. It was well designed. They worked the SkyTrain stations like crazy to get them into people's hands, knowing full well that this is a free newspaper. And they had a really strong reporting team here, and were breaking stories. And then all of a sudden, we just found out that that's all going to end, and it's ending in a lot of other cities across the country. What's your sense of kind of what happened there a little bit, and perhaps what, I suppose, positive news we can try and find in Canada's media, because neither you or I or anybody else wants that to go away.
Yeah, well, Torstar Media, Toronto Star, which owns those papers, has been in a tough place. They've been declining quarter after quarter. They've had a few recent financial twists and turns that shouldn't make it terribly surprising that they would have had to make some tough decisions as they've done. I think there's a fair degree of pessimism on the future forecast for Torstar. Generally, beyond the closure of these publications, I think looking to the main brand, the flagship newspaper, one of the great media brands of Canada, the Toronto Star. I love that paper. It's had a zest to it. The former editor, a friend of mine, Michael Cook, was the editor-in-chief of the Province newspaper for a long time. So people in Vancouver know his touch. One of the great newspaper geniuses of our time, I've always thought. But he has, like myself, seen a newspaper company, Toronto Star, go through so much cost cutting. 10 years ago, 2009, I started a new business division of the Canadian Press based out of Toronto to help the Toronto Star and actually the Globe and Mail to take advantage of some technology that had come along at that point in time that would reduce their costs for composing their product without compromising the journalistic quality, and even potentially add to it. So I've seen this from the inside. I've seen it coming for a long time. We used to say a decade ago, and I don't think much has changed, that the revenue model was changing dollars for dimes, because digital, that was the coming thing. It has been for a long time. It just doesn't, unless you're Google or Facebook sitting on the gold mine, you cannot turn those print revenues into equivalent revenues from digital. It just hasn't been done by anyone except those publications like the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, that have got a very exclusive, wealthy audience that they can charge whatever they need to make their brand work. So I remember at the Vancouver Sun, when I was on the management team there, we went and looked at different revenue models. Okay, we're going to put up a paywall. How did that work? Didn't work out. Let's take the paywall down. A few years later, let's put the paywall up again. It's been up and down, and no one has found that solution for the general interest daily newspaper. Years back, when I started Page Masters for the Canadian Press, I spent a lot of time in the USA, in places from Columbia, South Carolina to Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago. All these newspapers, great brands from yesteryear, were going through tough times. It was even harder there because they hadn't adapted the way we did in Canada. We were actually pretty innovative in Canada in reducing the costs of production and ensuring that we did the best we could to keep the journalism. That was really tough to do. There was some fat that we could, as managers, reduce through process improvement, technology adaptation, centralization, shared resources, that kind of thing. But when journalists start to pack up their desk and walk out the door because they've been downsized, you just can't replace that. So we've been on this trend in Canada. The Toronto Star, I think, is headed very much in the wrong direction. Post media is experiencing the same trends. The revenue continues to be difficult to replace in print, and I think it's just a very bleak time, and it's going to continue that way. This is, I guarantee, not the last time we will have this kind of bad news. Recently, I took part, at least as an audience member, in a panel at the Banff Forum, not in Banff, but in Mont Tremblant a couple of weeks ago. Paul Wells from Maclean's was there, and a CTV anchor, and a couple of digital upstarts, if you will, one from the right wing, one from the left wing. We're talking about the future, and I didn't hear anyone say, here's the business model that's going to solve this. But what I would offer is that we may see a return to the business model that preceded the modern one. The modern business model for newspapers was department stores and car dealers and classified advertising that needed to reach mass audiences, and they did that through newspapers. There were some great decades for that industry, then it went away. But you know what? Before all that came along, there was a totally different business model. If you go back to 1892, when the Province newspaper, BC, was founded, it was started in Victoria by political interest, by the Conservative Party. You look at the Vancouver Sun, it was founded in 1914 by the local Federal Liberal Association in the riding of Burrard, because they wanted to be competitive against the province, which they saw as this media vehicle that was overwhelming their liberal values. And so there were other papers too with their own views, but it was pretty overt in terms of the political origins. And nowadays, when people look at Facebook and politicization of media, I think there's a sense, oh, this is new and bad. Well, actually, I think it may, in some sense, be the cycle turning over and a bit of a return to that. And that's, it sounds kind of negative that it should be going this way. But on the other hand, if there's disclosure of interests and we know who's behind a media interest, and maybe that's a positive. If you say, I have these values, I want to find a media product that shares my values because I know I can trust them to report the news I want the way I want, then you can have that choice. I think I'm maybe stretching a little bit. So much has changed in terms of digital, the way people consume, obviously. I'm not sure there's a simple return or whether that's a good thing, but I think it's a possibility that we will see philanthropic interests. You think, look at Jeff Bezos. He's bought the Washington Post newspaper, and he is so rich that he could keep that thing going and well-staffed forever if he wanted to. And he's been, I think, seen as fairly neutral politically. He's not strongly activist at this point in time. You never know; it could change, or he may have a more subtle way of getting his things across, his agenda across to his people. But I don't think we want to live in a world where our major media brands are controlled by super billionaires. I don't think that's a good outcome. everyone wants to move towards a more democratic system. I don't know, Mike. What do you think? Am I close to being on target here? You've had as a columnist, as a critic, a particularly up close view on this.
You made some interesting points about the possibility of a media that is divided up around particular either ideologies or interests. We're already seeing it, and some cases we're seeing some pretty good journalism as a result of it. Over the years, we've known David Beers, and the Tyee was an entity that was largely driven by the labor movement. We've seen perhaps more aggressively partisan news come from places like from the Broadbent Institute, Press Progress. You see National Observer, which we know has its foundation out here on the West Coast, but is now seen as a national entity that is supported not only by readers, but by admittedly philanthropists, as you describe them. And then here in BC, we've seen the launch about a year and a half ago of the Orca, which is a decidedly more sort of center-right, free enterprise / BC liberal, if you want to put it into that classification. Although I note they don't really have any sort of political voices in the sense that there's no elected officials that speak from that publication. But we do see some very interesting and enlightening stories. And of course, I think even Resource Works itself has done some interesting blogging and stories along the way about things that we, and editorials that we read in papers. And I'm not entirely sure what I feel about that right now. There is, I think from the public standpoint, a desire that there is fairness, that there is openness, and it's not being funded and supported by, as you say, the billionaire class. Jeff Bezos is leading what will soon become $1 trillion company, and I suppose he has some ability to kind of sit back and maybe not intervene in the mandate of the Washington Post or any other of his media properties. But Amazon have been a tough player when it comes to taxation within the places that they have their workplaces. So, there's part of our society that would have some issues with that. So I actually think that there is some positive, and I was looking for something that was a little less gloomy. I want to see fine journalism continue to thrive in Canada. I like to go to the award ceremonies, such as the Websters and the Ma Murrays, which celebrate some of the other journalism happening here in BC. I've been to the events where I felt like it's a little bit of a wake, but thankfully I think that people are coming around to the fact that the people don't want to just hear a story about an industry in decline. They want to hear the positive stories about us being able to really break news and tell the public of what's happening out there.
There's still a cultural need to have a defining narrative that is something we share. And, while I've been in London, one thing I'd love to do when I'm here is, of course, read the lively printed newspapers that are abundant.
Arguably the best in the world. I mean,
it's just a reminder that settling in with the Sunday papers as I did today on a Sunday that we're speaking, it's just a great experience. And the things you encounter that you didn't expect to, I didn't go looking for that topic. It's not in my Twitter feed, but hey, look, this is a fascinating, unexpected story. I would never have found it. Back when I was composing front pages and newspapers, it's been a good number of years since I had the fun every day of doing that. We had the sense as editors and reporters that we were part of creating a daily shared experience that was more than just a bunch of things on a page. It was the zeitgeist. It was the hours that we would spend thinking about what should go on the front page, not just on the front page, what should go on top, what's the picture, what's on the bottom, what's this new thing that's happening that needs to be there, we need to consider, because it all adds up to something that's bigger than just a bunch of pieces put together. And we were telling this story. It was like the story of our lives every day. I don't know, maybe that's overselling it and little inside baseball, but it felt that way. And now that we don't have it in most people's lives, I think there's something missing here, that sense. But it's not as if the younger generation, I guess I'm old enough to say that now, hopefully it doesn't sound fogyish, but the excitement that I see amongst young journalists in the narrative, the story, in long form journalism of hey, does it take 6 or 10,000 words to tell that story? I'm going to get in there and tell it, and we got to find a platform for this to be part of our culture and future. You know, the talents I see and the insights in getting that picture and that movie, that editing, that infographic, information display, the research and digging and overcoming the problems of forcing bureaucrats to yield up what you need to get and forcing politicians to be accountable. I mean, that's important stuff. And if it's lost because we have lost the kind of platform in which to put all that stuff, then that's a big loss of our culture. And so we're very much at risk. So when the local star publications fold up, we're losing some culture. It has to go somewhere, or does it go away? And if it goes away, we're lesser for it. And this has already been happening in numerous small communities. I don't have the numbers, maybe you know them, on how many fewer dailies we have today in British Columbia communities than a few years ago. It's shocking when you see the number that have declined. And that experience in a community that they used to have of hey, we're part of a story that's unfolding every day, we who live in this community, it's damaged by that. And it's not just a commercial convenience that there used to be, you know, the local rag to put the ads in and so forth. I mean, over the century that the modern newspaper evolved, it really became the fabric of our culture. And ensuring that the things that are good about that, you know, we don't necessarily need ink on our hands and more recycling. Okay, we can get, you know, evolve and change for the better, but we don't want to lose culture because, well, culture is incredibly hard to create. You can't knowingly go forth and do that. So we've got something so good that's lasted for so long. How are we going to keep it going? And it's, like I was saying, no doubt we have the up-and-coming talents to be able to sustain that. They need to have a business model that's going to work, and not necessarily to bring back print, but to ensure the platform's there. There's a few good examples out there. I love what Farhan Mohammed is doing and his team with the
Daily Hive.
Daily Hive.
Yeah, and they're now expanding down into Seattle and Portland, I think I read.
Yeah, they came at it. You know, they had a hard time in the first couple of years getting respect of other journalists because they didn't seem to be doing things that were conventional. They kept at it. I had the chance to meet with Farhan a few times and encourage him and introduce him to people. I think they have just completely of their own creation been able to bring the talent together and show that if you figure out your market, you can serve up content to it and stay in business and grow your business. So that's a great example that, you know, we shouldn't be necessarily despairing in every sense.
I 100% agree, and I'm also a huge fan of the Farhan and Carm and the guys that have been pulling that. What used to be called Van City Buzz, now the Daily Hive, is becoming a really interesting business that's shaking things up for sure. And well, you know, and I was also going to just comment that for you and I, we should occasionally embrace our fogyishness. You know, it's
is it okay to do that?
It's okay to do that. We can,
right.
You know, we're not Generation Z, that's for sure. Stewart, listen, we've had just about an hour together today. So much ground that we've covered here, and I wanted to have one last question for you. How's the pub food in London? Has it gotten any better?
Oh yeah, it's getting better, and the beer's pretty good too. But the food has improved. There was a time when you could have pretty nasty food to go with your pint, but they have mostly solved that. In fact, it's spectacular what people can eat, and it's also the internationalization of the pub cuisine. It's not just that it's better, but it's global, and it's pretty cool what you can find on your menu.
Not that you needed any excuse to want to go to London, England, but that's good news from on the ground there. Stewart Muir, Executive Director of Resource Works, thank you very much for coming on the Vancouver Overcast podcast, and we have to continue this conversation, hopefully in person listen next time, and I'm going to just kind of roll right out. And thank you, sir, and safe travels, and we'll see you back here in BC.